I am the communications manager at IRETA. I'll be moderating our webinar today. I would like to go over some quick housekeeping items about how to use the WebEx technology and how to access continuing education credits. First, we would like to encourage you all to participate in today's webinar via two methods. If you have questions for our presenter or are experiencing any technical issues, please use either the chat function or the Q&A panel to communicate your questions. Our presenter, Dr. Chad Luke, will leave time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. Feel free to submit your questions through the chat or Q&A box at any time. This webinar is approved for 1.5 PCB and/or NADAC credits, which are free. You can also request a general certificate of attendance at no charge. Please take note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs to be available in your My IRETA profile because we have to cross-check your attendance on the webinar with our WebEx technology. After the webinar, you will receive several follow-up emails. The first will be an email with a link to the evaluation. The second will have information on how to access your certificate of attendance and continuing education credits through your My IRETA account. We may send you an additional email to remind you of the evaluation. I would now like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Chad Luke. Chad Luke, PhD, LPC, MHSP, NCC, ACS, MAC, is an associate professor at St. Bonaventure University, a licensed professional counselor and master addictions counselor. He is the author of Neuroscience for Counselors and Therapists, Integrating the Sciences of Brain and Mind, and Applying Neuroscience to Counseling Children and Adolescents, a guide to brain-based experiential interventions. Okay, Dr. Luke, if you are ready, I will hand things over to you.
Thank you, Marla. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and
Great.
clear.
All right. Good to hear. Well, good morning, everyone. Well, it's morning where I am. Hope you're having a great day. It's crazy that it's the end of January. I'm really excited about getting to spend this time with you all today and trying to stay calm because this is really exciting. The more I study neuroscience integration and addiction, the more aware of I am of how much I don't know, and that's kind of intimidating. But times like this where we can all come together gives me a chance to grow, gives me a chance to get back in the literature and also hear from practitioners and other scholars feedback on the presentation, on the content, through your questions that you ask and observations that you make. So I look forward to hearing from you about any of your thoughts on that. If you have questions about the material or have suggestions or want to reach out to me, you can contact me at drchadluke@gmail.com or at cluke@sbu.edu. So, all right, well, you know what the goals are for today. You read the stuff. What I prefer to think about is what you want from today. So we won't take a poll about this right now, but I'd love for you to just take a moment to think about over the next hour, 90 minutes, what do you need? Is it a jolt of energy, revitalization? Is it a sense of community? Is it that feeling that you're not alone in the struggle to provide effective treatment and to stay encouraged? Is it a new idea or whatever it is? So I'd love for you to just to take that in your mind, sort of hold on to it for the next hour and a half, because what you get out of this will largely be based on what you hope to get from it and what you expect. And so I want to encourage you to just take ownership for that as we start. I'm going to go through my little spiel, and hopefully along the way you'll pick up some things that are useful for you that will help you invigorate your practice. I started this in the fall when we did part one. Really just want to take a moment of just a few seconds of quiet reflection on addiction-related losses that we encounter on a daily basis in our work, in our family, in our friends, extended networks, in the news. But also, we can't talk about addiction-related losses without recognizing the context of pandemic-related losses. Um, So what I mean by that is, you know how I usually liken the pandemic to divorce, where it's so common now, it's so pervasive that we lose just the extent of how difficult it is and how detrimental it is to people's well-being. So we are still in that context. We are going to be unraveling that context, the implications of the pandemic for decades to come, and especially in terms of neurobiology, what we're learning. And so, if we could just take 5 or 10 seconds and just quietly reflect and send some positive energy out there to those we've lost and the losses that we've been exposed to directly or vicariously. Thank you for doing that. Um, we learned so much from the losses, and we want to honor those losses and those who have lost, and be grateful for the things that we haven't lost yet, and that motivate us to do good work. So, all right. So let's dive into this. I've got a lot to cover. I want to give a brief review of part one with some new things added in. And then I want to get to sort of 5 methods of intervention that we can talk about today. So we're all wrestling with what is addiction, where is addiction, and how can we treat it. And I know many of you are seasoned professionals, and you've been doing this for a while, and it's important to honor that as well. So some of the things that you'll hear, you may challenge. Some you'll be things you haven't heard before, or things that are familiar to you. So, and I just want to recognize that these questions are the questions that pervade our professions. The more we learn about the brain and neuroscience, the further the answers seem to get from us. And so it's an exciting time. It's also a challenging time to try to keep our practices invigorated. All right. So let's start with a definition that I kind of use to help me frame this work. So addiction is a neurobiologically based relational disorder that manifests itself in disordered cognitions, behaviors, emotional processing, social functioning, and intimacy. Its origins may be traced to difficulties in receiving nurturance from primary caregivers, resulting in deficits in social and emotional regulation. These disordered systems lead to compensatory behaviors that limit pain and quote unquote outsource neuroregulation to substances, behaviors, or pathological relationships. So there are a number of definitions of addictions, of addiction. And this is just my attempt to try to communicate how I am approaching this topic. It's not a perfect definition. It's not an authoritative definition. It is just my definition from many years of addiction treatment practice, as well as many years of reading, writing, and doing research on this in this area. So we're going to look at a little bit closer at this in a bit, but the question of where is it? I used to. This is a big chart. I used to address this question: where is it? Dot 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 in the brain, and I still write about that in that way. But I think it's more useful to think of it as a multisystemic disorder, as many of you do. And the 8-factor meta model that I've been writing about that for a while now has 8 components that are all neurobiologically informed, but they really are 8 dimensions of the phenomenology of an individual. So, how does a person experience relationships, their cultural milieu, their relationship with their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors? How do they experience their environment? And then within that environment, individual experiences from the past and the present. And then how do they experience their biology? So they have genetics that they inherited, and they have behavioral habits that um, increase or exacerbate or mitigate some of those biological underpinnings that they have. So I think that addiction rests in these 8 systems of the human phenomenological experience, and understanding how they work together and the neurobiological basis underlying them can really help us have build a more comprehensive picture of what addiction is, um, And I'll say more about that in a little bit. So this is the nice wheel that my wife, who's a graphic designer, crafted for me some time ago to help me try to conceptualize this. And then you can tell I threw in all the boxes because that's not my gift area. All right. So here's the conceptualization for stress and relationship and their contribution to addiction. So early nurture builds capacity in the brain and the nervous system, and that helps. So these early healthy attachments help mitigate um, any genetic anomalies or vulnerabilities that we're born with. Without that, we don't develop. Our brains don't imprint and form the regulatory capacity to deal with stressors, and so we get really dysregulated. So the stress response triggers the need for connection. So hopefully, when we feel stress, we're drawn toward relationship. But in addiction, we're drawn away from relationship or relationship with an inanimate object versus a healthy attachment figure. So that substitutionary nurturance can come through a substance, a behavior, or a toxic relationship. And so that's kind of how we're framing this to set up for the interventions that we want to look at. What we know from the research is that the combination of stress, especially stress, what you're looking at is an image of the part of the reward system in the brain that is highlighting the dimensions of chronic variable stress, absolutely pandemic stress. So, stress that is recurrent, unpredictable, uncontrollable, that affects us socially, psychologically, and emotionally. What we know is that a brain exposed to stress over time, these irregular stress that has peaks and valleys, but really stays constant for a period of time, we lose the capacity for goal-directed learning and memory and behavior and fade into compulsivity and habitual behaviors. So what you're seeing here in the chart is the dorsolateral striatum is involved with habitual learning and compulsive behaviors. The dorsomedial is with goal-directed learning and memory and behaviors. The cool thing about this, it's not cool, is that we know from animal models that the dorsal medial stratum, the dendrites in there that receive signals experience apoptosis, which is cell death. They start to recede when under chronic variable stress. But the dorsolateral stratum that controls compulsive and habitual behaviors, those dendrites start to proliferate. And what that means is that you have the brain adjusting to chronic stress, chronic variable stress, by compensating and moving from goal-directed behavior to life-preserving habitual behavior. Just don't think about it. Just go through it. And you may have found this over the past 2 years with the pandemic that it's hard to set an intention and follow through on that. And instead, you fall maybe back into old habits or habitual behaviors that affects the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we move, the way we relate to other people. And so some brains are more vulnerable to this than others. And that really helps us understand some more of the complexity of addiction, that our brains do undergo transformation. Now, that transformation is not irreversible. It can be changed back, but it takes a sustained, connected environment. And a lot of folks that we work with in addictions don't stay in treatment or in recovery long enough for the brains to start changing. So let's bring this back to sort of that chart plus a classic quote. The man takes a drink. This is goal-directed behaviors in the dorsomedial striatum. The drink takes the drinks. This where we're moving to the dorsolateral striatum, where we're becoming more habitual, and then the drink takes the man, where we have the stress-induced dependence, where we reach for an object or a substitution to legitimate connection. Was there a question about the orientation of this? Just want to check. I saw something pop up, and then a little squirrel brain missed it.
I think somebody might be having connection issues, but
Oh,
we'll
okay.
handle that on our end.
Okay. All right. Just wanted to check. Um, okay. So here's our nice glowing quote. This is something I alluded to earlier. we are still at a place where there are arguments over whether the brain disease model of addiction is legitimate. Um, because if it, the argument goes that if it were right, we would have more medications that treat cravings and dependence than we do, or a higher rate. Well, there's a lot of sociological issues in that, in terms of access to affordable medically assisted treatments, um, that partially explain why more people aren't using certain substances, medications for help. Um, we don't know which came first a lot of times. Is it the disordered brain that creates the addiction, or does the addiction create the disordered brain? Um, what we know is that both are true. We just don't know for each individual person which came first. Um, and the question then becomes like, so how does that matter for practical purposes in our treatment? And I think there's some ways that we can look at this together today. Um, so when we think about how to treat it, so people fall prey to addiction when they're overwhelmed by how imperfect, frustrating, boring, empty, lonely life and human relationships can appear. Remember, we're not talking about the person you pass on the street who does not have some of the risk factors of vulnerabilities that we just described in the 8-factor model. Um, but many of us can really identify with this idea about the quality of life and the characteristics of life, especially when we're in a low or vulnerable period, like we've experienced in the pandemic. Treatment can be a base where the individual with the addiction can relearn stress tolerance and emotional regulation, and where they can both consciously and unconsciously experience how relationships can provide rewards for them. This is fascinating. So you may be familiar with the term neuroception. This is a term from polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges' model, that says that our brains really are communicating at a level outside of awareness. And I think that this is important for genuineness in treatment. I feel like one of the things I love about working with folks with addictions is that they can sense a lack of genuineness. And a lot of that is the threat detection system really tuned in to the risk factors in another person, who they know the difference between someone who says they care and someone who really does care. And so this is where treatment really, the proverbial rubber hits the road, is can we be genuinely connected to the person we're sitting across from, and recognize that they've done some things that they're not proud of, and still endorse them in their humanity. And at least the last part, it can also provide a glimmer of reward that helps addicted individuals to tolerate the negative aspects, so that they're able to experience other equally authentic and real aspects of human experiences, like laughter, understanding, compassion, and connection. So you see us moving through these phases of the desperation of life, the need for connection, and then the more full experience of the lighter side of life that comes from those healthy attachments. And treatment is where those first healing attachments often take place for individuals that we treat. Okay, so how is it treated? I am a big advocate for the metaphoric model. And when I say metaphoric, I mean figure speech. It could be a simile or an analogy or a metaphor, or what have you. Um, the value of this is that the more I learn about neuroscience, like I said, the less I know, and the more overwhelmed I am by what I don't know. And the more committed I am to using it in as safe a way as possible. As it turns out, there's research now that shows that if you explain to someone their mental health issues in terms of biology, they are more likely to perceive their provider as unempathetic, and they're also less likely to follow through on psychosocial interventions. They're more likely to take their meds, but they're less likely to do their homework. And so integrating neuroscience is not just full steam ahead. We've got to be careful in dealing with the unintended consequences. So for me, using what we know about the brain to help us understand other facets of life and make those connections back and forth can be a safer way to intervene. So, how is it treated? I think through these 8 domains, using 5 modalities. Now, it's very convenient that all 5 of these words start with E. Um, what I want to say about this is that this is not necessarily a treatment order or a treatment prescription. It's 5 components that I think neuroscience-based treatment or neuroscience-informed counseling. I really like neuroscience-based treatment because it cuts across a lot of different professions and it's not just counseling focused. Empathy, engagement, expectations, education, and experimentation. These are not necessarily linear, but I'm going to present them in one at a time fashion as if they build. And then I want to present a metaphor, sort of a neuro kind of trick or gimmick, I mean that in a positive way, to help engage clients in the process of change, particularly when they feel pretty hopeless. So I think that's one of the great values of neuroscience in this domain is being able to explore new ways to find hope and new ways to find practices that can change people's experience. All right. So let's talk first about building empathy. Um, and you're going to hear me coming back to Hebb's rule a lot. So Hebb's rule is named after Donald Hebb, 1949. He discovered this principle that, and this is a simple oversimplification, but neurons that fire together wire together. So neurons that, this is the basis for habit, is that the more we do something, the more likely our neurons are set up to fire in a similar pattern to promote that, to make it more efficient. And so the more likely it is that we will continue to do those things. So the good thing is that we can automate processes in our life, like brushing our teeth or driving to work. The challenge is when we have to flossing because we went to the dentist and we're not used to flossing. We've got to now add new connections, the new neuro neurological basis for flossing. Or when we change jobs and we have to drive a different way to work, you'll find yourself, if you've ever found yourself going the old way to the old job, that's Hebb's rule at work, is that the brain is the picture of efficiency. And so it builds synapses, connections, neural networks to promote certain types of behavior. And when we get outside of survival, it's a matter of doing those behaviors automatically um, based on what we do. So that's why it's so hard to change behaviors because I used to use the example of like if you take Play-Doh, if you take a glob of Play-Doh and you rub like a paper clip or the tip of a pen across it, it'll start to groove. And in a sense, that's what our brain does. That's not what the grooves in the brain represent, but it is part of that process of learning to the point where as many processes that can move to the background there are, the better. But this speaks to the morality of addiction. I often talk to folks in addiction about, I don't talk to them about it, I just share my perspective that, in my opinion, an individual living in addiction has 2 morality codes, 2 codes of ethics. There is their own personal code when they're straight, and there is the morality code of the addiction. And so you have people really trying to wrestle with how can I be this person who would never do XYZ, but when I'm on the stuff, I become a completely amoral or immoral person. And really recognizing and reconciling those 2 capacities within the same human being to live that way. And that's part of the moralization of addiction. You know, you have addiction driving this behavior, but you have a person implementing it. And the same person who said a month ago that they would never stick a needle in their arm, they would never abandon their child, right? So um, this is part of that morality addiction, and we'll say more about that in a little bit. So A lot of the metaphors, analogies that I draw from are from the brain's connection to the visual system. It's our most complex sense. It has a whole lobe dedicated to it, an occipital lobe, and it really helps me understand and try to explain in ways that make sense to other people, to explain in terms of the visual system. So astigmatism, one way to build connection to our clients and the people that we serve, especially for those who don't have a history of addiction themselves, or didn't grow up close to it like many of us did, that it can be hard to feel connected and empathy for that individual. Well, in the case of an astigmatism, you, you're born this way. You're, instead of being round, your lens of your eye is shaped like a football. What that does is it distorts all incoming signals. So it changes your perception of the whole world. So I can speak to this personally. I used to play basketball, and my shots were always just a little bit off, and I didn't realize that I had a astigmatism that wasn't corrected. And so what that meant is that the image is always just a little askew. It's a little bit vibrating, and my vision isn't clear like it could be. Well, if you grow up with an astigmatism, you don't know any different. So we think about um, individuals growing up in environments that you could say that the environment was astigmatic, or you could say that they, as an individual, based on their genetics and early environment, had this astigmatism where it really transformed everything they see in the world. So instead of seeing people as a source of meaningful connection, they may see them as a risk. So it's important that if you're a person who doesn't have astigmatism, that you recognize that the world looks different to people with astigmatism. And it's it's not a moral failing, it's a distortion. And they need some sort of corrective lens. Sometimes it can be done through surgery now, through glasses or contacts. But without that, their vision is skewed. And if they've never known any different, this is just how it is. This comes back to the morality of the individual. Their moral code is a little bit different because their view of the world may be skewed. The point in all this, that empathic connection, is to help move away from blame and shame to who is responsible for the next right behavior. So instead of focusing on what I've done, it's what I'm going to do next. So that can be a point of connection with that astigmatism analogy. Um, I want to ask if there's questions or how you've used something like this. But I'll keep moving to the engagement part. Um, Engagement is, I use this provocative question: what if your addiction is not your fault, but it is now your responsibility? And I've shared the reaction I've gotten from people with this. Um, it's not my fault, but I have to deal with it. That sucks. Or many more expletives in saying that's not fair. Other folks have responded with, well, if it's not my fault, then I don't feel guilty and shame. And without my guilt and shame, I don't feel motivated to change, which is a heartbreaking way to think about um, how change is brought about, because people don't tend to make deep change through shame. It's often superficial change. So engaging by asking a provocative question: what if this is based on what we know about neuroscience and addiction in the brain? What if your addiction is not your fault, but it is now your responsibility? We do this a lot with families, and I've been a supervisor consultant for the last 10 years, and really looking at family systems where are always sort of looking for who is at fault in the system, rather than really doing the hard work of, okay, regardless of who's at fault, we're all in this relationship together. What is my individual responsibility for what comes next, and for each person in that system? Let's go to um, this. I think we have a minute. I want to show you. Ooh, I don't know if that's going to share. I won't show you this. I'll just show you the link. And you can Google amblyopia. Amblyopia is the best engagement tool that I've ever seen to take addiction out of the moral judgment domain and into action stage. So, and this came to me. I was at the eye doctor one time and I saw this video, and I'm like, oh, I was writing the first neuro book, and I'm like, oh, I could use that. This is amazing. So, amblyopia is also called lazy eye, and lazy eye is where, well, you've seen people where their eye doesn't track the same as the other. And there's so much to it. So what happens is when we're born, the eye that is impaired does not send appropriate signals to the brain to request stimulation and nutrients. So the brain then believes that there's there's not an eye there to innervate, to send glucose and blood flow and oxygen to it. So in that environment of um, limited resources, the nerves in the eye start to atrophy, and that's why you have, so there's six different muscles that move the eye, that help with focus, and the eye starts to droop, and it also loses its visual acuity. Think about this intuition. So you have a person, a child often is when it's caught, and they have this eye that's not tracking. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. And it's not doing that because it's not sending or receiving the signals and the nutrients that it needs. And what do we call it? We call it lazy eye. Now, nobody's saying the child is lazy, but it's this character-based description of an eye that is lacking what it needs to sustain itself. This can further be seen in the treatment for lazy eye. You typically just put a patch over the eye that is stronger, and in 2 to 6 weeks, the eye that has amblyopia is stronger again. Now, there's exceptions, of course, and I'm not an optometrist or ophthalmologist or any of those agists. Um, but you tell the brain that there is something there that needs support, and it responds, and it starts sending nutrients, and it starts to innervate and build those neurons, those synapses back to cause the muscles to work, to help with the focus, to help with the health of the eye. And so we think about addiction. This is this use it or lose it, and this is another dimension of Hebb's rule: is that neurons that fire together wire together. Neurons that don't fire together don't persist. And so you have this optimized system again, where when we use something pretty regularly, it becomes more and more efficient. When we don't use a system, that system atrophies because those neurons and those synapses are repurposed to support other behaviors. So in this situation, you think about think about your clients or yourself. Think about the areas of your life where were not appropriately stimulated, and how did that affect the growth and development um, of that area of your life. I think that folks struggling with addiction have these uh, deficits in any one of these 8 areas, 8 domains of life that we talked about, that begin to atrophy for lack of use. It can be problem solving, it can be emotional regulation, it can be critical thinking, it can be relating and connecting to other people, it can be developing empathy, all these things where they start to atrophy because they're not being used. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean that literally. The systems in the brain that support social connection, social functioning, emotional regulation, cognitive problem solving, and critical thinking, they stop proliferating in terms of their synapses. Remember, we should go back to we're thinking about the basics of the way neurons work, and that it can take up to 10,000 neurons firing in synchrony to make one action potential, to move one signal across to the next neuron or group of neurons in a system. This is fascinating because we, when you think about that, taking that many, we need all we can get to support healthy behaviors. But as those start to die off and get repurposed, we lose the capacity. So the less we use it, the less access we have to use it going forward. Again, I think this is a focus on cortex, not character. Anybody in this situation, social deprivation, emotional deprivation, cognitive deprivation, behavior, any of that, we start to lose strength there. If you've ever had a cast on for 6 weeks, 3 months, that limb gets weaker from lack of use. And so we can begin to think about, oh, what what is the proverbial or the metaphorical eye patch that we can use in this case to help encourage this person? Okay, going on about that one. I love that one. And if you've seen any of my other presentations, I probably talk about it every time. Okay, let's move to another part of engagement. And that's where there's reason to hope. And we won't get into this in great detail, but I've got some references there for you. What we're learning is that the hippocampus in addiction starts to withdraw. It happens in trauma in the case of PTSD. It happens in addiction. The hippocampus really governs memory. It's not where memories are stored, but it's the executive director, if you will, of memory. Well, what Bickle and colleagues discovered is that you can take folks struggling with addiction and give them memory training, and it helps them reduce delay discounting. Delay discounting is a form of delayed gratification where in the moment I want to fulfill a need, even though I know that down the road I'll feel better if I didn't do that. So a classic example for me is I'm sitting on the couch. I have this passing thought of, oh, I could go exercise or I could eat that candy bar that's in the cabinet. Um, I know I will feel better in 2 hours if I don't eat the candy bar and I get up and move. But that's not the truth of what it feels like in the moment. And I'll hasten to add that I am not comparing, in strictest terms, candy bar and getting up to the opioid crisis. I'm just using it as an example from a sort of a pedestrian, civilian way of thinking. Training our memories strengthens the hippocampus. And what we mean by strengthen is it strengthens the neural connections there. It forces the brain to send resources to that region of the brain so that we can remember the future of how good it's going to feel. And this is not with people trying to lose weight. These studies are with people with addictions. And so memory training really does help. This is another way to engage because there's a chance that the clients you work with have not heard this before. They did not know that there was a connection here, that you can change your brain through memory development and reduce the propensity to give in to cravings in the short term by thinking about the long term. Okay. Again, this has to be nested in the context of a healing relationship. These aren't just facts that you can slap onto folks. Okay. Now let's talk about expectations. So we're down to number 5. Got some time here. So what do you see here? And do you agree with this statement? Give you a second to look at this. Okay, if you've seen this before, you've probably seen it with me before. It doesn't actually say ice cream is good, but it sure as heck looks like it. That G is a little bit showing because it changes every time I do this. But for those of you who did see, your gut instinct was ice cream is good. Now that you see this, why would your brain do that? I'll just pretend that you're sitting there thinking about it and I'm giving you time to think about it. Um, there's a couple reasons for this. One is our brain deals with partial information all the time. For example, we hear something in the background that sounds like a screeching tire, and we turn around and we mobilize to get out of the way, even if it was a, a machine, or I don't know what else makes it sound like a screeching tire, but you know what I mean. We have to fill in the gaps, and the gaps are filled in a manner that is consistent with self protection. So, um, what I mean by that is better to trigger a false alarm than not respond to a potential threat and then be eaten or be killed. The other thing that sets expectations is, for those of us who agree with the statement that ice cream is good, that is our lived experience. How might expectations play here? Well, we have experience with ice cream being good. And so when we see the tops of those letters, we're drawing from that experience to set the expectation for what is there. Makes sense? Think about the expectations that your clients and the folks you work with come in with. They're all based on experience, based on the last treatment or the lack of treatment or the last person that had facial hair like that other person in their life, whatever it is. And this is fine, well, and good when we're talking about something innocuous like ice cream is good and playing a game like this. But what about this one? What do you see? For people in addictions and people with trauma and people with attachment issues, they often see threat where there is none, which again, the initial alarm signal is fine, but it directs behavior. And so when I see threat everywhere, I fail to expend the energy needed to connect with that person, to take some risks, because the threat is everywhere in my environment. And that's what we are dealing with when we're talking about working with addictions and the way the brain is shaped to protect the individual, the organism. And so I think it's important to normalize this for folks, that they should not. Oh my goodness, a pet peeve in treatment, especially in group treatment and residential, that I consulted in for years, is folks who come in and the first few days of treatment, they love everybody. This is a safe place. They've never been around people like this. They're really motivated to change. And that really flies in contrast with what we know about how addiction progresses. By the time you need residential, your threat detection system is on overload. And so you have this kind of reaction formation acting. The fear is filtered through this presentation of self as, oh, I'm good. I really like it here. You seem really trustworthy. Really? I don't think you should trust me that much this certain, and they don't. So there's another point of empathy here and connection, engagement, as we said, that these 5 E's kind of show themselves at each stage. We did this already. I wanted to show it to you again because it took me like hours to come up with that letter combination. I know. Um, so now it gets to the point of education, and we're educating throughout this. But I think that one of the things that is really difficult for us in treatment is to know what is the correct balance of process and content. How much should we be sharing information to educate our clients, and how much should we be holding back and really letting them come to some of this awareness themselves? I don't know what the proportion is. I think that we tend to over educate as if education is what transforms lives, when it's actually connection. But education is a lot more efficient and cost effective than connection. Um, and in a lot of cases, folks don't have the capacity coming into treatment for connection at the level that we might hope they would. And so there's a struggle to make some sort of contact. Um, Education is important. We can use this example. Basically, your left eye sees stuff in the left visual field, and is processed in the right hemisphere of the occipital lobe and then vice versa. But it also flips the image. So the image that's projected into the occipital lobe is upside down. Well, why don't we see things upside down? Why is our perception, our phenomenology not seeing things upside down? The reason is it's designed to be corrected that way so that when it's processed, it's turned the right way around again. Um, I think it's important that we communicate that the work of recovery, the work of neuroscience-based treatment, is to help us know that things like this we see with our brains, not with our eyes. And you've heard this before. You've probably said this before. Um, but our perception is sketchy. that that what we see is really an interpretation of energy. So there are stimuli in the environment that is turned into digital signals that are turned into electrical signals that are given meaning. And again, as we established in the previous one, that meaning is assigned based on experience. And so um, when we talk about your best thinking got you here, that's kind of what this is about. Is people are really fixed in their views, but their views are distorted, and we can educate them that that's not how the brain works. That and that's not how vision works. That a lot of times what we see is an interpretation of what's there, not what's actually there. I have another example. If you've ever seen the blind spot simulation, where you'd have like a piece of paper. If you just take a printer paper and turn it on its side, and you put an X on one side and a dot on the other, and you have people close their eye and move the image, the one dot disappears. And that's because we have a literal blind spot in our eyes where the optic nerve attaches to the retina. There are no receptors there. And so um, the reason that we can't observe the blind spot except through this experiment is that we have overlapping fields of vision that protect us from that blind spot, that compensate for that. But a lot of us live with a blind spot that's uncorrected. And so I ask in treatment context, who or what is that second eye for you that helps compensate for that blind spot? Who is watching your back? That's why we don't do recovery in isolation. You've got to have someone to help you with your blind spots. Um, okay. Another point of education, myopia. So this would be like taking um, uh, the tube from a roll of gift wrap and close your eye and looking through it, and then thinking that what you're seeing is the whole room. And so we see the forest and we see the trees, and we need both of those. And so the left hemisphere of the brain is really more like the microscope or the telescope. It really helps us tune into details. This is the language area, the literalness, thinking in straight lines, logic, and it sees things in bits and pieces. Whereas the right hemisphere is geared toward holistic thinking, creative thinking, emotional processing. Even though the brain is bilateral in that these functions are found in both sides, but they're dominant in these two hemispheres. Doesn't mean that a person is left brain dominant or right brain dominant. It means that each hemisphere is specialized for its own purposes. But we have to have them working in concert, or else we, as I say here, running into a forest is different than running into a tree. And a lot of people in recovery are trying to run into a forest and they keep running into trees. And so, one of the ways that treatment progresses is looking at which area is least strong. What area, and a lot of times you'll see it in both sides, a lack of logic or reason. But you'll also see a lot of struggles to emotionally regulate, to zoom out and see the whole picture. And then we add the last component of this, which is the two hemispheres function as one brain because of this nerve bundle called the corpus callosum in the middle. That's densely packed nerve fibers that help them communicate seamlessly as if they're one brain. And so, how can we help folks cultivate these two sides of themselves and then integrate them into a healthy person? And I would argue that in treatment, if we're not doing the emotional regulation work and we're not doing the cognitive logic reasoning work, then we might only be giving half treatment. Um, but you see this all the time in treatment. Folks come in and say, I'm not here to work on my relationships. I am not here to work on emotions or talk about emotions. I'm not here to talk about my anger. I'm here to work on my addiction. As if they are these separable things and they're not made up of the whole person, um, and two sides of the same coin. So this is again, we're using visual systems, visual conditions to help illustrate. So myopia is where you really see only the small things and not get to see the big picture. All right. Oh, let's get to experimentation. I'm going to show you my favorite experiment. And when I say experiment, I use it from the perspective of trying things without knowing how it will turn out, not in a specific risk taking, rolling the dice kind of way, but in a let's try something you haven't tried, and specifically for the purpose that you don't know how it's going to turn out. Most of the things in your life, you kind of know what happens next. So let's try something different. So I want to show you a couple of tools that I use. And this one is from a book on neuroeducation my friends Rayson Miller and Eric Beeson wrote. That it's on there. It has tons of different tips, but this is in there. So what I'll do is, and we could do this here if we were live. We are live, but in physical space. What I'd love for you to consider doing is get out a timer on your phone or whatever, and time yourself moving through this maze and see how long it takes. I'll go ahead. I'm going to wait a few seconds for that. I'll give you an excuse to drink water. Okay, once you've done that, and for the sake of time, we won't go through all of these because I want to show you the progression of this. We end up doing 3 trials, and each time, see what happens to your time. Okay? And if this were printed out, you could use a pencil or a pen, and I would encourage you to print it out or find your own brain maze. What do you think happens to the time trials each time? Do people get faster, slower, stay the same? Well, a vast majority of people get faster. But about 25% of people who do this with me in workshops and stuff get slower. Why is that? Well, it's an interpretation of the guidelines. I've seen people assume that they have to find a new path each time. And I've seen people assume that they can't use their finger to trace it or use a pencil to mark it down. And so they end up getting slower. Um, the other 75% get faster. And why is that? This is Hebb's rule. Your brain is learning. You're learning that going right to start off is not the correct way, so you don't start off right the next time. Unless you have a deficit in learning that makes you choose the wrong direction every time, even though you know it's the wrong direction. So this is a fun way to engage people in experimenting in how the brain learns and how we can understand our clients' problem-solving strategies. Well, once we do this, we're getting cocky, and so we move to the next maze. And I ask people to just time themselves. So you want to time yourself doing this maze, you can. Guess what questions come up immediately? Or they're more like protests. Hey, there's no beginning. You didn't tell us where to start. So we could infer a couple things from that. One is that I'm mean and withholding information from you and making you struggle. Another is that there's no wrong place to start. You just have to start. The other part is you don't know where the ending is, and maybe you get to define success for yourself. So I've seen several solutions by clever participants in this process, and I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't know that there's a way out of the maze. I get frustrated really easily, so I haven't found the way out. Some people decided to start in the middle and work their way out, and that was a pretty effective strategy. One ambitious group of participants said, "Oh, I just assumed that the black lines were the maze, not the white lines." Whoa, what a cultural commentary there, maybe. If you follow the black lines, you can absolutely get out in a much easier way. But doing this helps with understand a few things: problem-solving strategies, frustration tolerance, and solution seeking. What do you do when you get stuck? What do you do when the rules aren't clear? And that's, I think, what we find in recovery a lot is that we practice in treatment some of these scenarios about what to do, but then in the real world application is far more complex, and it gives us a lot of anxiety, and we may shut down and not do the things that are most effective. So then I move on to the third maze, and this one's really irritating. It has two arrows, but it doesn't tell you where the beginning is and doesn't tell you where the end is. And it's infinitely more complex. So I think as we move through this, I'm just going to go back to these three. So you have a very basic maze where people can practice improving their skills, and learning how to learn and solve problems. The next is how to define one's own goals, to find a place to start and start there, and then define your own measures of success, um, and deal with the complexity of that. And then really even flipping the model that, and I'll talk about this in a minute, maybe. Um, and then you move to the most complex one where there are arrows. We don't know where to begin, but it very quickly feels overwhelming. I don't know about for you, but on my screen, it starts to blur and all the lines run together. And it would take a lot of time and patience to get there. I think this is relapse and recovery, that relapse is a part of the stages of change for a reason, and that there's a lot of trial and error. It's not whether you get stuck, it's what you do when you get stuck. And so this can really draw out a lot of frustration in the session. And if you're getting frustrated over solving a brain maze that has zero stakes, what's it going to be like for you outside of here? And again, we're using this process of empathy and engagement, education and experimentation, and expectations. Let's say that, to draw out their own motivation. Okay, one more step to this. I also use this thinking about harm reduction. I know there's a lot of opinions out there. I don't have the answer. I just have a perspective here. Should you upgrade your TV that has 720 pixels per inch or whatever 720p means, or should you go for the 8K ultimate resolution? It's probably 16K out now. Um, which is better? Well, objectively, the 8K is the clearest possible resolution if it's the highest. But can you still function and watch a show in 720p? Yes, it's not the same, but it's not the same. They're different. Again, I'm not trying to argue for harm reduction or against harm reduction. What I do argue for is challenging. Remember back on the maze where you could follow the black lines or the white lines? We're flipping the question. Instead of only focusing on what should be taken away from this person's life, how can we focus on adding things that are values based? How can we essentially crowd out addiction? How can we develop the skills to build relationships, to solve problems, to engage our curiosity, to explore enjoyment in such a way that we're moving towards something, not always moving away from something? And of course, in addictions treatment, it's far more complex than this. And we have to do both a lot of times, or to save somebody's life from overdosing, we, we have to go abstinence only or medically assisted treatment. Um, I'm just posing a question here that, based on what we know about how the brain learns and how we um, how we solve problems, how the brain develops. Can we alter the perspective a little bit by also focusing on what people can add in? Um, I've heard this on my weight loss app. Um, it's not just about cutting out sugar, but maybe adding in fruits and vegetables. Um, if I'm honest, I haven't done either of those. But um, for clients, one thing that we can do, and I really like this, and I've added a caveat from an article that um, all the new neuro trends. Joe Rogan is always preaching about neuro gum. There's not a lot of hard science to back that up. But what there is science to back up is that free apps like Insight Timer, where you can track your progress and spend um, 5 minutes a morning working on breathing, working on mindfulness, or focusing on something other than the pain. Um, or a pulse oximeter, that could be on your watch, or it could be a $12 thing you pick up from Amazon to help you track what your blood pressure, heart rate is like. And if you have a wearable like a smartwatch, all the better to be able to track sleep and those things. So, um, okay. And I saw a note about something. Let me just add in the cultural considerations. The genetic differences, the criteria for uh, one of the domains is the sociocultural milieu, so the family that people come from, the larger racial groups, the religious groups that they're involved in, all have particular views on some of these things, and so that's always in the background and sometimes in the foreground of the work that we're doing, and so we want to be respectful of that. Okay, and I mentioned, I think Marla mentioned this, that a lot of this work is sort of laid out to a certain extent in these two books. I'm not here selling books, but Neuroscience for Counselors and Therapists, the second edition came out in 2020. And there's a chapter on addiction, and then applying neuroscience to children and adolescents is also, it just came out like a couple months ago with my friend Chris Schimmel. Really, there's a chapter on addictions in there for working with children and adolescents. So I think that's it. I can stop sharing screen now. And I made it through. I actually cut back a ton of content so that we would have time to discuss this so I can learn from you in this process. So I'm going to get a notepad and write down some comments and questions, and would love to hear what you've been chatting about and presenting your questions and so forth.
All right. So some comments and questions were coming in during the presentation. So first one, uh, someone asked, what was the term for vagal theory? The VAGAL.
Uh, Polyvagal?
I think that's what they meant, yeah.
We talked about neuroception in the context of polyvagal.
Okay. And then, okay, so this one is kind of a two-parter question and comment based on that wheel towards the beginning. So somebody said, how would you define addiction per the literature? Where would you fit drug use out of curiosity? People use who are not traumatized or exposed to it. It is hugely cultural and glorified per social media. People use because of boredom too. And then they went on to say, as a private practice therapist and one who works in detox, I have seen the difference between those who do not have interest in treatment or help and those who acknowledge a problem and do something about it immediately. That being said, I don't think addiction is not their fault to some degree because they do something about it. They are they, they are being proactive in their treatment, and those who just say, "Oh well," or succumb to the addiction, then shouldn't have any accountability or thought or fault. What are your thoughts?
Ooh, okay. So let's go back to the first part. Um, could you could you pull out the main question there, Marla? Because
Sure. So somebody
I
just
think I
wanted
heard it.
to know what your definition of addiction was, and because people use drugs who aren't necessarily. Well, so the wording used in the question was, where would you fit in curiosity about drug use, people use who are not traumatized or exposed to it? I think they mean trauma there. It
Mhm.
is hugely cultural and glorified per social media. People use because of boredom too. So I guess they're just asking, what would you say addiction is? And I would elaborate on that myself, saying, drug use does not equal addiction, which I'm sure are your thoughts as well.
Mhm. Yeah, um, yeah, it's kind of complicated that we don't have the differentiation again anymore in the DSM between use, abuse, and dependence. I think there absolutely is a developmental component to substance use. The For me, my concern is the uh, glorifying of alcohol use. Um, it's I feel like in our world, it's a little bit like Russian roulette. You don't know when that drink is could turn into something greater. Um, I do think that peer-based or media-based substance use um, is still a red flag because, again, who's doing your thinking for you is a question I often ask. But I do agree. So I worked in an adolescent treatment center, residential treatment center for addictions, and you had 13, 14-year-old kids in there who popped a drug test for weed, and we're putting them in 12-step groups telling them to acknowledge step one, that their lives become unmanageable, and they're not buying it. And many cases I wasn't buying it either. The challenge is, what are the other choices that happen in the context of that drinking? um, for example, can you go out with friends and not drink, and what would that feel like? Can you still be quote unquote yourself? Um, can you tolerate the any harassment that you get about not drinking or being a goody two shoes? I think that speaks to developmental themes about how we um, engage in behaviors that are productive for the reasons that we decide, not what those around us decide. Um, I think it is a fine line trying to determine, is addiction coming from a place of trauma and compensation, or is it just using because it feels good? And I think we're seeing a lot of that as well. What we know is that for a certain percentage of those folks, they'll use it for fun and then not ever be able to put it down. And others will be able to walk away. And that doesn't feel fair either. Um, to the component of um, not your fault, but your responsibility, humans are pretty sensitive to blame and shame. And we rarely make healthy choices based on guilt and shame. And so I find it just unproductive to look at it in terms of fault and instead look at it in terms of responsibility for what happens next. Um, that may be a 10-cent answer to a $1 million question, but I'm happy to try again for whoever asked that question.
I think that was a good response. So another question, or I guess more of a comment. Somebody said many folks will end up in treatment who are crossing the threshold of middle stages of addiction. As a result, they feel they can't relate to the later stages of addiction. Teaching them about the progression of addiction is vital. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. I think about middle stages of addiction as stages of change. So maybe I have a problem, maybe I have some responsibility, maybe it's not, but at least it's not as bad as those folks. I see that a lot in treatment groups, the social comparison. Um, so the late stagers laugh at the early stagers because you haven't done anything, and then the war stories begin. And the it's the same goes for middle stagers, I think. looking at how the disease model views addiction as a progressive disease. And disease is not my term. It's not our term. It's a term that is used in the brain disease model of addiction. Um, that it is progressive, and I think that the way looking at how the brain changes over time through repeated behaviors can really be instructive um, in helping people conceptualize in a concrete way. Oh, that's what that looks like. Um, and using metaphors, analogies to other areas of their lives where um, things didn't stay the same. They either got better or they got worse, but they rarely just hold steady in homeostasis. Um, can be part of that. If I'm understanding the question.
Okay. Then someone said, many times the expectation of what you can accomplish in treatment has to be adjusted. That being said, the weakest link in treatment is often sorry, I can't speak. Um, Many times the weakest link in treatment is aftercare and continuing care. And I think what they meant by that is aftercare and continuing care is the least paid attention to, or uh, less importance is placed on it. So it wasn't really posed as a question, but I don't. Would you like to speak on that at all?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that as a society we've paid lip service to treatment because we cover it for 28 days, and the whole 28-day model. They're going to have to redo that Sandra Bullock movie because it's what is it now, 7 to 10 days, depending on insurance. It's really difficult. Um, we the investment needs to come in the community afterward. How are we creating these communities of care that support the development of these individuals when life gets terrifying? I mean, one of the progress areas of progress that we're making, but we're really slow to make as a society, is um, still found in the brain disease model that I got excited and lost my train of thought. Um, is that we don't invest enough in the connection that follows the the treatment. So what happens when people are off drugs, but their brain has not changed back? It hasn't rebalanced itself, for lack of a better word. They're more vulnerable to this person's point, more vulnerable in aftercare than probably they are in the first few days after detox, because the supports are not there in the same way that we need them to be. That's just sort of a rant. Everybody knows that.
Uh, One comment was submitted. It's all medical care is harm reduction. We can't argue for evidence and not argue for harm reduction. So again, just a comment, not a question, but
Mhm.
do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sometimes the harm reduction really runs toward methadone and Suboxone and some of these clinics that were giving synthetic heroin to heroin users. And is that really harm reduction, or are we just state sanctioned addiction? I think if you're saving people from dirty needles and STIs and um, dying from overdose, that seems like a reduction in harm, but it absolutely is not the maybe a societal ideal. It's a good start. I think if you're talking about harm reduction in terms of cutting back on drinking rather than going all in abstinence, I think you're going to have a fierce discussion on your hands from the quote unquote old timers and the newcomers and everybody in between. I think it's important just to keep the dialogue open and not believe that we have the final answer, um, because there are some things with the brain that a harm reduction model makes sense to begin slowly changing those courses. But in other ways, abstinence is really the only way to change the brain. And so I think the debate is still fresh from a neurobiological perspective, and I think it's welcome. Um, thank you for that comment.
Okay. Um, so in relation to that, oh, I guess you already spoke on that a little bit. What is the role of classical condition and operant condition in addiction? Do you think that addiction is only a learning process?
Oh, it's a great question. Um, I so I think that one of the things we know from the earlier comment or question about difference between sort of a trauma-based or a genetic-based or early environment-based path to addiction versus a curiosity or developmental process is that all of life is learning. So everything we do is either a function of classical conditioning or operant conditioning, associative learning or instrumental learning. So either we're pairing things together and we make that association, or we're learning new connections between things. Um, so all of life is learning. So even when, so it's the question is, where in the learning process are we exploring? So every time we make any kind of action, our brain learns about that, and that's reinforcing the more we do it. Um, that what we also know, and this is part of the problem with relapse, is that when the brain learns new things, it doesn't erase the old things; it just overwrites the old thing with new learning. Often we think about learning and memory like a computer file where, oh, you just erase it and save a new file. But imagine if your computer, this important document that you have that you wanted to start over, and so you deleted it and then you wrote on that same file. If at times under a certain, I don't know, your system is under stress, that old file comes back up. And that's what really happens in relapse. And that's where addiction absolutely is a learning based process, because that old learning can come back up at any time under stress load. And so that's why we want to fill people's lives with new productive behaviors rather than just trying to eliminate old unproductive um, behaviors. And this is the example you might think of is if so you were dating somebody for a while, or you're in a relationship with somebody for a long time, then you were with somebody new, and under a tense moment you call out the other person's name, not the new person. It's sort of that same process of learning. Of course we go back to these old patterns of learning, and I think that's why in addictions, in recovery, we're always just sort of one trigger away from relapse, not because we're weak, but because our brains learn these self survival mechanisms really well.
All right. And then one more question here. What are your thoughts on dual disorders of mental illness and addiction? Like the chicken and the egg analogy that you mentioned earlier. Do you think addiction as a coping mechanism should be on the wheel?
Mm-hmm. Ooh, so co-occurring disorders. Um, this is one I haven't resolved for myself. I My answer usually, and I have lots of students ask this question, lots of supervisees ask this question. I don't know how you don't treat both at the same time, and at this, and by the out of the other side of my mouth, I say I don't know how you treat both of them at the same time. Um, so we think about sort of the continuum of life saving, like what's the person most at risk of dying from? Is it depression, or is it the drug of abuse or addiction? Um, as far as on the wheel, I think what we're learning from neurobiology, and there's a whole study, a whole funding stream in the National Institute of Mental Health called the Research Domain Criteria that looks at the underlying biology of multiple disorders. So, for example, why does ADHD and anxiety have similar symptoms? Why does depression and anxiety look so similar, at least at a certain level? Because it has the same neurobiological substrates and the same um, neural functioning that underlies it. But we tend to treat only symptoms rather than root causes. And part of that is because we don't have a blood test for anxiety and a blood test for depression and a blood test for all these other disorders. So I do think that, with that being said, that addiction and the co-occurring disorder probably shares some underlying dimensions from this 8-factor model. So a certain way of thinking or the same environment developed addictive thinking as well as sort of depressive thinking. Um, I think it's also important to remember that our diagnoses are social constructions. You know, depression's only been around for what, 50 years, but we know that the phenomenon has been around longer than that. Um, it, the criteria all kind of are just things that we agreed on become this disorder. And so I think it makes sense that same thing with the new criteria, new since 2013, for substance um, use disorder. People can die from a mild substance use disorder, and people can live from a moderate substance use disorder. These are just ways we as society have tried to understand them. But I think that looking underneath to the underlying structure, thought patterns, feelings, emotion regulation, social contact and context, the role of trauma. When I say trauma, I want to just add quickly that there's, the big T traumas and the little t traumas. We found that, especially in the case of chronic variable stress, that these small t traumas look the same in the brain as big T traumas. The difference is the small t traumas lead to gradual uh, neuroplastic changes, whereas big T traumas instantly change the brain in that moment, practically. Because if something bad like that happens, we got to make sure that we don't get in that situation again. Anyway, so that was a lot of blah, blah, blah. Please let me try again if I've missed the question or comment.
No, that's good. Let's see. We have one more coming in here. Someone said, I agree regarding choosing to treat the most lethal issue first regarding comorbid disorders. What are your thoughts on treating trauma as far as EMDR, brain spotting in early recovery clients?
Oh, had to ask that question. Um, I like EMDR, but I'm going to say something that's going to probably irritate some people. If you look at the 7 steps in EMDR, everything but the bilateral stimulation are steps and characteristics of good quality care across all treatment modalities. Um, I do think that for certain people, I think EMDR gives newer clinicians and seasoned clinicians more confidence to follow that protocol. I think it gives clients hope because this feels like a really science-based, it is a science-based approach. And so 15% of the change that people experience is based on their belief in the efficacy of the treatment. 30% is the therapeutic relationship. So I, I think being able to engage the clients with that, like how do you see these two things going together in your life? What is the connection between trauma and addiction? Um, Maybe a lot of times they don't see that. Others will see it as an excuse. Well, I can't get clean because of this bad thing happened to me. Okay. So you have a lived experience that you can't get better. That is a good example of a person trying to take away their own responsibility for their recovery. But part of our responsibility as treatment folks is instilling hope that there is life on the other side of trauma. And we talk about it as post-traumatic growth, not just post-traumatic stress. There is life on the other side of addiction. Um, and so again, it comes back to building a sense of hope without making false promises. So a lot of brain spotting and a lot of the newer trends in neuroscience-based treatments are not totally proven at the level that we want, or they're also sort of a rebranding of some of the classics that we know work really well, but they sort of have a new look to them that I think has its value. Um, but I don't think that a clinician who is not trained in brain spotting or EMDR should think that they're inadequate to work with a client who has trauma. Um, I think there's some really good resources out there. Trauma-based cognitive behavioral therapy is a really good training that's very, very accessible that folks can get certificate in that helps take you through the process of working with trauma.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. We really appreciate your time. I'm going to go over a few more things as far as housekeeping. I just need to pull up my script here. I apologize. My computer was being wacky. Um,
Can I just thank everyone for being attentive and joining me in this journey? And I welcome your comments and your questions. If something that I said seemed off to you, please let me know. I'd be happy to hear your feedback. I hope you guys have a good day.
Perfect. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks so much again for your great questions. We would like to remind all participants that the recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to the webinar library located on iRetta's website sometime next week. Once we have these resources posted, a link will be sent to all of today's webinar's registrants. I now want to remind you of our evaluation and CEU process. You will receive several follow-up emails from us. The first email will include a link to the evaluation, and the second email will include a step-by-step instructions on how to obtain CEUs. Please note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs to become available because we have to cross-check your attendance records. We would like to specially request that you fill out our evaluation. It should take no more than 2 minutes of your time. Again, we want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day to participate today. If you have any questions, please email us. The email address is info@iretta.org. And with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you and have a great afternoon.